Australia is full of bities, creepies and crawlies, and some are right on the end of our noses. No flies on the Queen, but why is this man talking to cane toads?
It's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, a case of do or die. The world will always welcome lovers as time goes by.
The Adelaide River, 50 miles from Darwin, is today the scene of a daring hunting expedition.
The most dangerous creature on the Australian landscape is still man himself, and he hunted crocodiles almost to extinction.
In Japan, but these monsters are man-eaters, and the only good crocodile is a dead one.
In 1971, crocs became protected, and since then they started taking a few liberties themselves. One who found out just how tenacious they can be was a university philosophy lecturer, Val Plumwood, who went canoeing in Kakadu in 1985.
I'd been given the idea that I would be fairly safe in a canoe, and people don't think that now, but they did think that then. As I got past it, from behind me there was this great crash against the side of the canoe, so I realised it was attacking the canoe. But I pulled up the canoe alongside a big paperbark tree. I had this kind of blurred vision of teeth and water. I had 3 death rolls, so I think I would have died after the first one. The water had been deep enough.
Val Plumwood eventually escaped, and it's not much point telling even a philosopher that you're more likely to be drowned in a motor car than you are being taken by a crocodile. There have been only 30 fatal attacks this century, but it's a nasty way to go, and that also explains our terror of these. 3 times as many people are taken by sharks than crocodiles, but that's still only 1 person a year, and you're twice as likely to die from a bee sting or lightning. But try telling all that to a shark. In 1929, 8 Australians were killed by sharks. At Bondi, Colin Stewart was fatally mauled while standing in waist-deep water. A girl was maimed by a shark at Collaroy, and a youth attacked at Maroubra. Another man was killed swimming at the suburb of Balmain. By the 1930s, the government was forced to introduce a meshing system. Costly business, but the only effective method of reducing the problem.
They've landed more than 100 since meshing began. Daring canoeists cross the narrow stretch of water that separates the bathers from the monsters. There's still life in the death dealer, but he's soon dispatched.
There hasn't been a fatal shark attack on a meshed beach in Australia since the system began in 1937. But the trouble is that some busy thoroughfares like Sydney Harbour simply can't be meshed, and some places have proved to be worse than others. Looks peaceful enough, doesn't it? But this is the nation's most notorious location for shark attacks, the tranquil and inviting waters of Middle Harbour, right in the heart of Sydney. There have been 6 fatal attacks here since 1942, the most horrific here in Sugarloaf Bay on a humid and overcast Australia Day holiday in 1963. A 32-year-old actress named Marcia Hathaway was cooling off in less than a metre of water when a shark ripped her leg off at the hip. And what followed was a cruel chain of events. The beach where she'd been swimming was inaccessible by road. While she was being taken by boat to the nearest landing place, her fiancé, Fred Knight, bravely swam to another place where he could call for help. An ambulance was waiting for the victim when she arrived, but the steep road was slippery. The vehicle started up the slope but began to lose traction, and then the clutch burned out. Men came from everywhere and tried to push it up the track. The unconscious girl was transferred to another vehicle, but it was too late. Marcia Hathaway was dead on arrival at hospital. Henri Bourse, on the other hand, not only survived a shark attack, but he was perhaps the only person whose attack was actually captured on film. Shots later supplemented with some reenacted footage.
It's while I was in the water there that all of a sudden I was taken. At the impact, I knew immediately what had happened. I was dragged underwater and shook like a dog may with a slipper. And in about a minute and a half, it was all over.
Henri Borse was rescued by an incredibly brave girl, Jill Hind, who grabbed a rope and went to his assistance in the turbulent, blood-stained water.
The leg came off, and I had to get to the surface to get air mainly, because I could have drowned if it had taken any longer. And everything after that just happened automatically. Everyone went into action. They got me on board the boat. They put a tourniquet on the stump and stopped the bleeding. And if I hadn't have lost the leg when I did, I would have drowned. There's no doubt about that.
It all happened 30 years ago. But in 1998, I reunited Henri and Jill.
This is the person who is so brave. I mean, he was incredible. We had an hour and a half journey back to Port Fairy, and he'd lost half the amount of blood in his body. And he realised that if he lost consciousness, he would go, didn't you?
That's right. Yeah. I really didn't have a leg to stand on.
Henri Borse has now passed on, but not before he spent another 25 years in the sea he loved. Coming up next, a tale of true romance and too many rabbits. Barwon Park, and by the time Thomas Austin completed his grand house in 1869, his rabbits were coming along nicely, thank you very much. They became such a delicacy they were offered for sale in the Geelong Advertiser. The animals were bred here and became so famous that when the Duke of Edinburgh came to Australia in the 1860s, he was invited here for a shoot, and 450 rabbits were encouraged to commit suicide for the trigger-happy Duke. The Duke was shot himself on that tour, Australia's first act of political terrorism that took place at Sydney's Clontarf Beach. The royal personage recovered, and so did the bunnies. In fact, the Duke had hardly made a dent in their numbers. By the 1880s, the Australian government offered £25,000 to anyone in the world who could get rid of them. And so this place, Rod Island in the middle of Sydney Harbour, was allocated for experiments by the eminent French scientist Louis Pasteur. Now, Pasteur soon fell out with the authorities, but his assistant, a Dr. Lavoie, continued. And you know the French, there was soon romance in the air. When the famous French actress Sarah Bernhardt toured Australia, the authorities insisted that her pet dogs were quarantined on the island. She'd visit them there, and pretty soon Mademoiselle Bernhardt and Dr. Lavoie were an item and the talk of Sydney. But I digress. Ironically, it would be a romantic liaison with two other scientists that would conquer the rabbit problem. You see, just when Australia was being overrun, in South America they faced just the opposite dilemma. Rabbits being raised for meat and fur were dying from a mysterious disease. It was called myxomatosis. And in the 1920s, a Brazilian scientist named Dr. Aragão told our government that myxo could be the answer to our problems. The government's response was ill-advised.
They poured cold water on it, and they responded by saying that the rabbit was a very important animal for the carcass and fur trade, and they didn't want to interfere with that trade by destroying rabbits totally.
It was a decision the Australian scientists would come to regret. The Western Division of New South Wales, which could support 15 million sheep in the 1890s, could carry less than half that 40 years later. The animals were killed in almost hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, millions would be destroyed, and if the animal world has a history of its own, this will be its Holocaust. In the 1930s, however, an important new character entered the myxomatosis story. She was Dr. Jean McNamara, a Melbourne paediatrician who was overseas studying when she met scientists working with myxomatosis. She became convinced that the disease had not been adequately tested.
She wrote some very pointed articles in the Melbourne newspapers and insisted that myxomatosis must be given another trial.
At first, the new trials were a failure, but then myxomatosis, which escaped from a test site in the Murray Valley in 1950, would change the entire face of Australia. Indeed, myxo would save the nation. Eventually, of course, the rabbits would become immune and the war would continue with poisons like 1080. And now, the best part of a century later, we find the whole scenario being repeated with the Khaleesi virus. It also began as an experiment on an island, Wardang Island in South Australia. And likewise, it got loose. So far, Khaleesi virus is meeting with only mixed success. And meanwhile, the bunnies at Barwon Park are still down in their burrows telling the kids they've seen it all before. Coming up, roos to the left of us, locusts to the right. But there's only one pest that goes to all the right places. There's a famous poem called Said Hanrahan which pretty well sums up the ravages of the bush. Hanrahan's a farmer who says in the middle of the drought, we'll all be ruined. Then the rains come and the grass grows, but Hanrahan is still moaning. There'll be bushfires for sure, me man, there will without a doubt. We'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan, before the year is out. And in 1955, the whole of Australia watched as the drama of the Land of Extremes was played out yet again.
Water, water everywhere. And in February, the heavens opened over the whole of New South Wales, releasing a deluge rarely equalled in intensity.
Much of the state of New South Wales was affected, but the worst hit area was in Maitland, right next door to where the Edwards lived in Newcastle. Ken wrote of yearning to go to Maitland to show the suffering, but sadly his camera was in for repair.
February 26. People have been on rooftops for days and nights with huge coffee-coloured waves bashing up to the guttering. Army ducks are sinking. A tug from Newcastle has foundered. Nothing but emergency calls on wireless. Maitland is without gas, water or electricity. Tales of death and suffering are legion.
Eventually, the calamitous floods would take 22 lives and leave 10,000 homeless. And the Edwards family, like many other Australians, would be haunted by these images for years to come. In fact, the Australian landscape is in a constant state of war with nature. Around 1913, it seems that overseas people didn't think very highly of kangaroos, or for that matter, dancing girls. And foreign newsreels like this one hardly painted the Australian man on the land in very good light. Our squatters, or ranchers as they were called, were seen as a cross between English gentry and Keystone cops. A bunch of ratbags charging across the scrub, firing at anything that moves. We caught kangaroos by the hundreds, and those which didn't go to zoos were either destroyed or sold for meat. Over the years, the carnage of kangaroos has been so gruesome that the media's avoided showing it at all. But with some pests, it seems we just don't even know where to start. Almost every summer, somewhere in Australia, we're more than knee-high in grasshoppers. Locusts have been in the top 10 plagues since Moses was a boy, and these creatures can do as much damage in a single night as kangaroos can do in a whole summer. It's a problem that's proving to be extremely difficult to deal with. But perhaps the greatest menace of all is right at the end of our noses. Australia's dead hard, and of course, they're everywhere. Is it any wonder they call it the Australian salute? Yes, flies, and it seems the best we can do is try to keep them at arm's length. And over the years, we've been encouraged to spend a fortune in the process. We outlay more than $50 million a year in various forms of fly control.
Louis the fly, I'm Louis the fly, straight from rubbish tip to you.
Martin spray and the flies pass away. Martin spray and the flies pass away.
Amazingly, if you started with just a single pair of flies and there was nothing to eat them and plenty of food for them, at the end of 12 months there would be 10 to the 18th. That is 10 million. And that's just not flies, that's tons weight of flies. That's enough to cover the earth to a depth of 4 meters. Perhaps this sort of hand-waving will always be part of our history. And certainly the flies themselves haven't missed many of the major events so far this century. We fought flies as well as Turks at Gallipoli. And flies also attended the first major political event covered on the talking film, the introduction of Joe Lyons' cabinet in 1931. Lyons has flies to the left of him and flies to the right, and eventually the Prime Minister himself has to take the occasional swipe as he gamely proceeds with matters of state. And horror of horrors, flies even showed no respect for Her Majesty when she came here after her coronation. When you can't even say there are no flies on the Queen, what hope is there for the rest of us? Coming up, the worm that turned Queensland around, and how to make love to a cane toad.
As time goes.
Modest building, the Banaga Cactoblastus Memorial Hall in southwest Queensland is a monument to biological foot soldiers.
This is the story of the greatest plant invasion the world has ever known. Holding in its spiny grip a vast area of pastoral and agricultural land, spreading at the rate of 1 million acres a year.
Many Australian school kids know the story of how Queensland was once nearly overrun by prickly pear, and how a group of scientists spent years patiently testing until they came up with one of the most spectacular victories in the history of biological warfare.
And now we see the most important insect of all, called Cactoblastus cactorum. Its introduction from the Argentine in 1925 soon turned the scale in the battle against prickly pear.
Cactoblastus would prove to be as powerful as its name and rescue 1/5 of Australia from destruction. And amazingly, even 3/4 of a century later, Cactoblastus reappears every time the pear dares to rear its ugly head.
They were imported from America, but actually this was their experimental station here in the background. It's just experimenting to see that they'd eat nothing else but a prickly pear.
But the trouble is, did that great victory of the 1920s make us too cocky?
It was definitely so. Cactoblastus and the success of it was something beyond people's wildest dreams. You know, people couldn't move because of prickly pear, and along comes this moth and just wiped it out. And then people thought, you know, we'll get the cane beetle with the cane toad.
Bufo, of course, you know him better as the cane toad, perhaps the most reviled creature ever to leap onto the Australian landscape. They were brought here in 1935 to eat the notorious brayback beetle, which was destroying Queensland sugar plantations. But alas, it was a spectacular failure. Another one of those dreadful mistakes. He's a ham, this one. The cane toad is a sort of prickly pear that jumps, and according to Glenn Ingrams, one of the world's leading experts on such creatures, the problem was simple.
Of course, what they forgot again. First, #1 lesson, biological control. The control must act on the target and the target alone.
Trouble was, the cane toad couldn't reach the beetle on the cane, so...
They just had no effect. They just ran off and ate the rest of Australian wildlife.
Since 130 cane toads were introduced from South America in 1935, they've spread as far as Kakadu, and some forecast they'll soon reach Sydney. Some have adapted so well to the local conditions they look as though they're on steroids. Instead of a saviour, what we've got now is a titanic toad that looks like Jabba the Hutt and destroys the local fauna like Darth Vader.
Death Aders will die in less than a minute. Boom, just knocks them.
So, poisonous and ugly to boot. Any good points? Well, yes. Some people even keep them as pets. And they are fascinating. For a start, they'll eat anything from ping-pong balls to mice. And they're a bit kinky. Cane toads will mate with dead females or even something that looks like a female. Mind you, if you look like a cane toad, would you care? And this is the sound that turns them on.
Did I ever tell you?
Dr. Ingram, are you sure you're a serious scientist?
I am a very serious scientist.
Whatever, they're a permanent feature of Queensland, and the locals either love them or hate them.
Right, well, this is said to be the preferred way of getting rid of these things in Queensland. A number 1 wood. No, I can't do it. I've choked. I'm sorry, Boopo.
No, the proper way is to put them in the fridge. The experts say they simply go to sleep and then into a sort of permanent hibernation. So, sleep tight, Boopo Marinus, the toad with attitude.